Welcome to Libyth. In the year 807, a man with an uncertain rank at the Japanese imperial court sat down to write a complaint. He did not call it a complaint. He called it history. He called it sacred tradition, the words of the ancestors, things gleaned from old sayings before they were lost forever. But underneath the reverent language, underneath the invocations of gods and emperors, what he was actually doing was settling a score that had been simmering for more than a century. His name was Inbe no Hironari, and the document he handed to Emperor Heizei that year would go on to be read for over 1,000 years as one of the foundational texts of Shinto religious history. It is called the Kogo Shūi, and it is, depending on how you choose to look at it, either a sacred record of Japan's mythological past or one of the most elegant pieces of political grievance literature ever produced by a defeated faction. The truth, as usual, is that it is both at once, and the tension between those two readings is exactly what makes this text worth spending real time with. Here is the situation Hironari found himself in. For generations, two clans had shared responsibility for performing the Shinto rituals of the imperial court. One was his own clan, the Inbe, sometimes rendered Embe, whose hereditary role involved the sacred objects and implements used in court ceremony. The mirrors, the jewels, the regalia, the physical apparatus through which divine power was invoked and channeled. The other was the Nakatomi clan, whose roles centered on the liturgies, the prayers, the spoken invocations that accompanied those rituals. For a long time, this division of labor functioned as a kind of balance. Two old houses, each holding one half of a sacred function, neither one able to claim the whole of it. But balance, in court politics, is rarely permanent, and by the time Hironari was writing, that balance had collapsed entirely in the Nakatomi's favor. The reason had very little to do with religion and everything to do with power. The Nakatomi clan was the parent lineage of a much larger and more dangerous force in Heian period politics. The Fujiwara clan, the family that would go on to dominate the imperial court for centuries through a strategy of marrying their daughters into the imperial line and controlling emperors as regents. As the Fujiwara rose, the Nakatomi rose with them, and the Inbe, who had no equivalent political patron, found themselves steadily pushed to the margins of a ritual system they had once shared as equals. This is the situation that produces a text like the Kogo Shūi. It is what happens when a one-sequel party finds itself losing not through any single dramatic event, but through a slow accumulation of small exclusions, fewer offerings directed to Inbe-affiliated shrines, fewer ceremonial duties assigned to Inbe priests, a gradual rewriting of precedent that always seems to favor the other side. Hironari's response to this slow erosion was not to petition for money or land or office directly. It was something more ambitious and, in its way, more dangerous. He went after the foundational myths themselves. If the present order can be justified by reference to the divine past, then the way to contest the present order is to contest the divine past. Rewrite, or rather, reassert a more favorable version of the founding stories, and you change the terms on which legitimacy itself is measured. What makes this maneuver fascinating, rather than simply cynical, is that Hironari was not inventing his materials from nothing. He was drawing on oral traditions that, he claims, had been preserved within the Inbe clan across generations, transmitted by memory before anyone in Japan had a writing system to fix them in place. The opening of the text itself dwells on this point with something close to grief. There is a real sense of mourning in the way Hironari describes the old method of transmission, generation passing knowledge to generation by voice alone, a chain of memory stretching back before recorded time, and the way that method was abandoned once writing arrived, and the elite culture of the court began to prize the merely written, the ostentatious, the fashionable, over the disciplined inheritance of spoken tradition. This is not incidental color. It is the entire premise of the book. Hironari is positioning his own clan as the last faithful keepers of something true and old, against a court culture that he frames as having drifted into frivolity and historical amnesia. The Inbe remember what the chroniclers forgot. That is the claim the whole text rests on. And here is where the structure of the Kogoshui becomes genuinely clever. The document does not open with the complaint. It opens with myth, specifically with the deeds of the clan's divine ancestor, a god named Amenefutadama no Mikoto, and the lineage descending from him. Only after establishing this mythological foundation does the text move into a retelling of national history, the same broad sweep of material covered in Japan's two great official chronicles, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, running from the legendary first Emperor Jinmu through to Emperor Tenmu centuries later. And only after both of those sections, the divine genealogy and the national history, does Hironari finally arrive at his actual purpose. A list of 11 specific grievances, 11 things he says the imperial government has neglected, 11 precedents that have been allowed to lapse to the detriment of his clan, and he argues, to the detriment of proper ritual order itself. The myth and the history are not decoration. They are evidence. They are submitted, almost in the manner of a legal brief, to support a conclusion that comes only at the end. This is myth being used not just to entertain or to explain the cosmos, but to argue a case, and that rhetorical structure is almost unique among the major texts of early Japanese religious literature. It is worth sitting with how unusual this is. The Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki are also political documents in their own ways, official chronicles compiled under imperial sponsorship always serve the interests of whoever commissioned them. But they present themselves as comprehensive national history, the story of the imperial line's legitimacy as a whole. The Kogoshui is narrower and sharper. It is a single clan's countersuit, dressed in the same mythological vocabulary as the official histories, but aimed at a specific and immediate grievance. And because it draws on the same pool of divine figures and events as the Nihongi, comparing the two texts side by side reveals something almost forensic. The places where Hironari's version diverges from the official one are not random. They cluster precisely around the moments where his own clan's status is at stake. In one notable case, where the Nihongi attributes a set of divine commands solely to the sun goddess Amaterasu, the Kogoshui gives equal billing to another deity, Takamimyusubai no Kami, who happens to be the figure the Inbe clan traced its own divine ancestry through. This is not an accident of variant oral tradition. It is special pleading, written into the structure of the cosmos itself. Elevate your own ancestor god to stand beside the supreme imperial ancestress, and you elevate your own clan's dignity by association. This is the move that turns the Kogoshui from a curiosity into something genuinely worth analyzing in depth. We are watching a Heian period court official attempt to renegotiate the terms of his clan's political standing by editing the architecture of national myth, and doing so without ever stepping outside the bounds of pious, reverent language. Nothing in the text reads as an attack. Everything in it reads as a correction, a restoration of something true that had been allowed to slip. That is the rhetorical genius of the thing. Hironari does not accuse the Nakatomi of usurpation in plain terms. He simply lays out the 11 things that have been neglected and lets the implication do the work. He does not say the imperial government is mistaken. He says it has been inattentive, that ancient precedents have fallen into disarray through nobody's particular fault, and that all he wants, all any loyal servant of the throne could want, is for the old order to be properly restored. It is a masterclass in petitioning power without appearing to challenge it, and that alone makes this text worth studying as a piece of political rhetoric, quite apart from its religious content. There's also something quietly moving underneath all the political maneuvering, and it's worth naming before we go any further, because it's easy to get cynical about a document like this and miss the genuine cultural anxiety running through it. Hironari is writing at a hinge point in Japanese history, the moment when an oral culture finally and irreversibly gives way to a written one. He is one of the last people positioned to remember, in any direct institutional sense, what it meant to carry tradition in memory rather than on paper, because his clan's entire claim to relevance rested on being the keepers of exactly that kind of inherited knowledge. When he laments the loss of the old simplicity, the old discipline of oral transmission, he is not just making a rhetorical move. He is describing the disappearance of the very thing that gave his own family its reason for existing in the world. The political grievance and the cultural mourning are the same gesture. Losing court influence and losing a world built on memory rather than text are, for Hironari, indistinguishable losses, arriving at exactly the same moment in history. So this is the territory the Kogoshui asks us to walk into. A short, dense, formally ambitious text written by a man on the losing end of a slow-motion political defeat, who responded not by attacking his rivals directly, but by rewriting carefully, reverently, persuasively, the divine history that both sides depended on for their legitimacy. Over the rest of this series, we're going to take the text apart properly. We'll look at the social and political world that produced this kind of document in the first place, the actual machinery of court ritual and clan status that made something like the 11 things worth writing at all. We'll look at how the text is structured as something closer to an argument than a story, and what that does to our expectations of what a myth is even supposed to do. We'll look at the figures who populate it, gods, ancestors, emperors, a rival clan cast not as villains but as rivals, and ask what each of them is actually standing in for. And we'll dig into the layer underneath all of that. The philosophical question the Kogoshui keeps circling without ever quite answering directly, which is the question of who gets to decide what the past actually was, and whether there is any way to settle that question that isn't, in the end, also a question of power. That's the angle this series is going to take. Not here is an old Japanese text, and here is what happens in it, but something closer to. Here is a defeated faction's attempt to win, 1,200 years later, an argument it had already lost in its own century. And here is what that attempt can teach us about how every official history we've ever trusted might have its own quiet Kogoshui sitting somewhere just outside the canon, waiting for someone to take it seriously. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.